Maybe we can begin by sort of laying out some terminology. So, Carol, why don't I begin with you? Maybe just to set the stage, what is a blockchain?
The blockchain is, and why am I getting this as the first question of the day? And I haven't been into the conversation. No, okay. So the blockchain, I would actually defer to you, Jerry, since you've written more extensively on this subject, but it's effectively the ledger, what is created from it's the transactional record as the algorithm is processing itself. And I would certainly defer to the more technical explanation if you'd like to do so. I'd like to go into Bitcoin and explain a little bit more about Bitcoin and the issue of whether it's a currency as the first use case off the blockchain.
Okay. Anybody else want to take a stab at what is a blockchain, whether it's Bitcoin's blockchain or any other blockchain?
I would just say for somebody new to the area, what distinguishes it from like a Google Sheet or just a SQL database is that the different parties, the system that's implemented in Bitcoin, which was the first of its kind, is a system where every party has to process all of the transactions eventually to update their copy of the blockchain, and their system for determining whether a transaction is valid is based on whether other parties trust that it's valid, and all this kind of happens at the same time, and the net effect is that a single node can propagate a transaction throughout the network very quickly and update a single database without having to go through a centralized authority. You don't have to go to the DMV and say, this title is moving from this person to this person. You can just take your title, your car title, and you can transfer it to somebody else. And everybody in the room sees it and says, yes, the title's moved there. And then everybody in the world sees it within a few minutes. So that's the elegance of the Bitcoin blockchain, is that the nodes do not know one another, but they're able to trust that the ledger is secure versus like having to trust a centralized authority.
I'll take the question as well. I believe that Satoshi Nakamoto did invent the blockchain, so by that logic, I'm going with that definition. To me, a blockchain is just a digital message passing system that removes all censorship. And in order for it to do that, it has to use proof of work. So to me, a blockchain is a proof of work, I guess, a type of database, but not really, it's a new one. So if it's not secured by proof of work, which is done by burning electricity for the security, I don't really consider it a blockchain. So to me, a distributed ledger or a private blockchain is just a database with admins from multiple organizations. I don't see immutability there. I don't see censorship resistance there. So to me, a blockchain is a proof of work algorithm.
All right, Alan, you're my only hope. I've heard three explanations of the Bitcoin blockchain, but of course we're talking about Bitcoin versus blockchain. So what is this blockchain that's separate from Bitcoin?
I was just going to say that at its most basic element, a blockchain is essentially a bundle of transactions that have been validated in some sort of distributed system. That is the block that has been appended to a sequence of previously validated blocks of transactions, forming a chain. The blockchain is a blockchain, or a distributed ledger, is essentially that linked system of a set of sequentially validated blocks of transactions. So to go to Jerry's question, maybe build on what some of the others have said, then what are these different blockchains? You kind of think about three different categories, and we saw that in the video when we started. There is the public or Bitcoin blockchain. That is the blockchain, the chain of blocks that underpins the Bitcoin transaction system. And that is typically when you hear about the blockchain, at least initially, you are hearing about the Bitcoin blockchain, the chain of transactions that have taken place since the origination of the Bitcoin transactional system in late 2008, early 2009. And you could do other things on that system besides transact Bitcoin as a currency, but that's what it's best known for. There are other public blockchains that are not the Bitcoin blockchain. So you may have heard of Ethereum. which is another type of Bitcoin blockchain, which is derived from the Bitcoin blockchain. It is essentially the same type of technology that's optimized for a certain set of other functions. Its settlement speed is a little bit faster. Some of its steps are a little bit simpler, and it is optimized towards programming the token that rides on that blockchain, particularly for smart contracts. And then there are private or permissioned blockchains or distributed ledgers. And so those are using similar technology, distributed system, distributed proof of work, or distributed validation of transactions in some way, but within a closed system, within a company, within an enterprise, where you've set up a similar system. So it is permissioned. You have to be permitted to come into the system as opposed to a public blockchain where you don't. And the transaction types and participants are bounded by those who are permissioned into the system. But it lacks the public blockchain or Bitcoin blockchain's transparency and also the immutability of its ledger.
So I'll just editorialize here for a moment and say that one thing that I've heard in these discussions that I kind of disagree with a little bit is that distributed ledger is equivalent to blockchain. I would say the distributed ledger technology is a superset. It just means you have a ledger that is distributed amongst parties, and you can all share and interact with that ledger. How you do that is up to you. One way you can do that is a blockchain, but there are other ways. You can have a simple MySQL database with shared access, and that would be a distributed ledger in some sense. Let me ask this. So what are the relative merits of using or employing the public blockchain, meaning the Bitcoin blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain, versus spinning up your own private closed blockchain? I'll start just down the line, sorry, Joe.
So the big one is security. The Bitcoin blockchain is secured by everybody who's committing their computing power and burning electricity to fight over the Bitcoins that are released every block. So as that happens, in the game theory, what we've kind of see play out is that people devote more computing power to earn more Bitcoins, which makes the Bitcoins worth more over the long term. And so they devote more computing power, burn more electricity. And so the net effect is that you have this large amount of computing power that is devoted to securing the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, so that if North Korea decided to spin up all their servers and start mining Bitcoin, would they be able to attack it? Would they be able to get 51% of the hashing power and begin to fiddle with the blockchain, double spending transactions? Probably not today, with the amount of power that's dedicated to that blockchain. So I'll leave some for the rest of the panel, but security is the absolute number one advantage of using the public Bitcoin blockchain.
I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. As I said earlier, to me, a private blockchain is just a database. I don't really see immutability there. And there's also going to be an issue. What if you are using a private blockchain and a shared ledger between multiple companies? What is your incentive to store another company's data? While it's another company's has an incentive to make you store their data. So you're going to have this prisoner's dilemma situation. So why use a public blockchain like Bitcoin, for example? You use it because you have to use it. I know a lot of us are speculators. We're holding Bitcoin. I don't consider myself a user of Bitcoin. Users of Bitcoin don't really care that there's a block size debate going on. They don't really care a single who the core developers are. They use it because they have to, because they're underserved by the current institutions in their value transfer. So anytime someone runs into a KYC issue, an AML issue, they can get around that issue by using the public blockchain and Bitcoin. So what I always say, if the government really doesn't like Bitcoin and they want to eliminate it, eliminate some laws. Legalize drugs, legalize gambling, legalize other things, simplify the tax structure, simplify moving your money cross borders. Basically eliminate AML laws. The more money laundering laws come in, the more they strengthen Bitcoin because it allows you to just get around the banking system. That's why you would use a public blockchain. I'm really not sure why someone would use a private blockchain other than just building a shared database.
I'm not sure that I would limit the use cases of the public blockchain just to avoiding the banking system and the law. There is certainly a role for anti-money laundering and know your customer policies and programs in a public blockchain. And I think you see that many of the companies that exist in that ecosystem follow those laws very closely. I think that to go back to the broader question that Jerry asked, there are benefits from a security and resilience perspective to a blockchain. The encryption, the full encryption of the system, the use of cryptographic proofs for proof of work, and the immutability of the ledger that make the public blockchain kind of the first real industrial scale application that really truly builds in security and resilience by design. The other aspect that you have in the public blockchain, and it goes to the video that we saw at the beginning, there was a graphic that showed that you needed a trusted third party as your intermediary. The public blockchain obviates the need for a trusted third party by allowing you to place your trust in the protocol and in the distributed network of validation and the proof of work that goes along with it, rather than having to trust any third-party intermediary. And so those that combination of attributes, its security and resilience by design, the immutability of its record, and the obviation of the need to trust any type of intermediary, make it a relatively unique system for transacting and for performing all sorts of other functions.
I'm not quite sure which way to go here, since we've heard two very different sets of views expressed. I think from the standpoint of democratization, which I think is your point, that it's making accessible aspects of the financial services world, as well as going well beyond that, as we'll see the use cases develop. Certainly, the transparency that's cited as a positive and as a negative. The immediacy or seeming immediacy of transaction or information settlement across the blockchain is also seen as being advantageous, though we know that it's not necessarily immediate. It may take longer than a few seconds. The other issues of encryption and so on are also very important, but again, there's two sides to every point that we raise here in terms of the positives and negatives.
I would also just say to Tone's point that if you're a user, you don't care about the block size debate. I would say that if you're a user, maybe you don't care about governance, but you do specifically care about the block size debate because you are the person, if you're doing a remittance, you don't want your transactions to get stuck. You want them to go quicker. And so the users should care about the block size debate.
They should, but do people that use dollars really care what the Federal Reserve does? You just care that your transaction works. You believe that you're gonna wake up in the morning and your dollars will buy you goods. And the majority of Bitcoin users, most of us in this room have not really met real Bitcoin users. They use Bitcoin because they have to, not because they want to. And I see the financial institutions, everyone complains, there's 3-day settlement problems and there's 3% fees. All of that comes from regulation. My email got to me within seconds in 1999. There's absolutely no reason why my stock or any kind of a digital payment through the banking system couldn't get to me as fast as my email did back in 1999. The Bitcoin isn't really making it faster. It just eliminates the regulatory overhead for people to use value transfer.
All right, so the question I asked about what are the relative merits of Bitcoin and blockchain, the one thing I heard as a merit is immutability and security. And it's pretty clear how that is achieved in Bitcoin and its blockchain. It's as immutable as you can get. Can you really get immutability using a private blockchain? And if so, how does that work?
People try, security, I guess, so immutability comes with security. If you were a private institution, you could copy Bitcoin's code right now, and you'd be able to run it, and you'd be able to introduce parameters that allowed for a single authority to revoke, reverse, modify transactions. And then from your perspective, it's immutable as long as you're the only person with the private key to ever change that code base. But when you're
How's it
dealing
different from like a MySQL database?
it's not. I mean, the end product is not. You're ending up. The only benefit is that if the coin were to be able to redeem for value, you would have a different business model than currently, which is currently if you run a database, PayPal, you devote a lot of effort to maintaining the database, and then all that money that you're spending on that database has to get recouped through partnerships. So when you enter into a partnership with someone, you say, listen, we're going to partner with you, and you're going to pay us this much a month to be a partner, and that's how you recoup the cost of your database. If you were able to otherwise create value for the token that's paid, you'd be able to partner with people just without having to make them pay you. They would just receive the token as a payment, the more that they contributed to your database. It's a small material.
I don't really see how a private blockchain can achieve immutability. We've only seen immutability in the Bitcoin blockchain up to this point, and it's only been around for, 7 years, and we have no idea if it's going to last. Any other blockchain that is proof of work, and you need proof of work to create these immutable value transfer or messages of value, I didn't say value transfer, a message of value, a digital message of value. You need proof of work to achieve immutability, and any other blockchain that's using proof of work is directly competing with Bitcoin for the electricity costs and for the hardware to run that proof of work mining structure, which is why I only see the future with one blockchain, just like we currently have one internet. I'm expecting it to be the Bitcoin blockchain only because it's ahead of the game. But if the Bitcoin splits into two like Ethereum did, then maybe there will be the mining power will move to another blockchain. But proof of work is what's needed to create immutability, and it's still up in the air how long that will last.
Does anybody disagree with that immutability can only be achieved through proof of work?
I would disagree with that. Okay. I think that when you opt for a private or a permissioned blockchain, you are exchanging the ability to control who participates in the blockchain and why they participate in the blockchain for the immutability that the public blockchain brings. You can have the benefits of security and of resilience and of the aligning of distributed members in a permissioned blockchain without the intensive type of proof of work that you use in the public blockchain, because again, it's about creating shared incentives by each of the participants in the permission blockchain that would do the validation. So proof of work is about, to my mind, about validation. The immutability comes from the fact that you have so many nodes in the system of the public blockchain. They are controlled by so many different people that to try to go in and physically alter that record would take so much computing power and the co-option of so many different parties that it is virtually impossible. And that's something you don't have in a permissioned environment. In a permissioned environment, you typically have a much smaller number of parties, and you typically have some type of third-party administrator. And the corruption of that third-party administrator, however unlikely, creates more of a risk for the loss of integrity in a private or permissioned blockchain than with the public blockchain.
Can I ask a question on that? So if you have a private blockchain, let's say between 5 banks, nice small community, and two of the banks have a contract with each other, and then there is value in escrow of that contract as collateral. A disgruntled employee at one of these banks hacks it because he has access to it and transfers the collateral to his own name. What happens after that?
Well, you have a couple of different options in that permissioned blockchain that you wouldn't have in the public blockchain. The first is reversibility. But second is, I think it goes back to the reason why the proof of work protocol was created. It's kind of and you all with programming background will correct me, but it goes back to what's charmingly titled the Byzantine Generals Computing Problem, which is how do you take a distributed number of leaders, of people who can control the way a system works, and align their incentives even where they might have otherwise have incentives to act in ways that are different or undermining to the group. And you align those incentives in the public or the Bitcoin blockchain through this proof of work protocol that provides that requires investment and provides rewards for that investment, so that disincentivizes.
So what I'm hearing is this: is that the finality, the immutability or finality of a blockchain is enforced in different ways. In a public blockchain like Bitcoin, it's sort of enforced internal to Bitcoin, whereas in a private blockchain, the enforcement happens by parties outside of the blockchain.
Right, but isn't reversibility the opposite of immutability?
Yes, and that's why again, when you opt for a private or permissioned blockchain, you exchange immutability for some of the other.
Right, so they're not immutable.
Yes.
Carol, and then we have
Okay.
one more question.
I'm not a technologist, but I've watched a variety of developments in this conversation for the last several years. And I do believe that there's certain economic principles that we've already seen emerge, where we've seen a concentration of the computing power behind the network into a smaller and smaller group of larger players. And I think the question is whether this true distributed network concept is going to be able to be preserved over time with the blockchain to allow for us to achieve what you've been describing as a true distributed type concept. But as we, are we going to ultimately end up with the blockchain being more of a private network? Because you may only have a handful of those who are controlling most of the network.
Okay, so we've got about 3 minutes left. So, quick, final question. Can you guys give us examples of use cases, of applications or use cases of blockchains? And maybe give us an example of a use case that can only be accomplished on a public blockchain, that could not be accomplished on a private, and vice versa. A use case of an application that can be only accomplished on a private and not on a public. I know that's...
Use case that can...
Let's start with, it can only be accomplished on a private.
No, I would say that there's nothing that could not be accomplished on a public blockchain with third-party applications layered on top of it.
What about the reverse? Something that could only be done on a public blockchain that could not be done on a private blockchain?
It's a tough question because you could permission a private blockchain to be run by a couple governments and have the same source code as Bitcoin, save for the inflation adjustment being controlled by those governments. And then at that point, I think you would be able to basically run anything that you'd run on a public blockchain on a private blockchain with those parameters. But the private blockchains that we're talking about today, like R3. There's a lot of use cases, so I don't want to limit it to the private blockchains that we've seen in the wild so far, because one could come along that looks like Bitcoin.
All right, I'll try and tackle this one. So again, I view private blockchains as just databases. So we've had these since the 70s. So there's everything is just functioning as it was. Now, as far as public blockchains go, what I think they are the common use cases people throw out. So again, to me, it's good for any censorship-resistant value transfer. Anytime you're afraid that your payment will be, reversed. Anytime you're afraid your payment will be, it will be questioned. Like my friends run like an NCAA pool, just $20. You fill out a bracket. We all do it in March. And like 7 years ago, he started like adamantly screaming, when you send me $20 in PayPal, for the love of God, please don't put for the NCAA tournament, because PayPal will see it as gambling and they might shut down my account and I need it for my business. So these are the kinds of little things that a public blockchain is good for. What a public blockchain is not good for is things like, I don't think it's good for things like medical records or titles. And there's a couple of things for that, because you are in control of your own data. So if you're in sole control of your medical records and then you lose your private key to all your medical history is now lost. And for things like titles, the government has to recognize your title. And if the government doesn't recognize the Bitcoin blockchain as like you do, they really don't care that your marriage certificate is on the blockchain or that your title is on the blockchain. They really couldn't care less. They care whether it's in their private blockchain or database. So those are just some of my examples at the moment.
I would go the other way, and I would say that those things that where you need high trust transactability, particularly in low trust environments, whichever type of intermediary or third party you don't trust, you can only really do on a public blockchain. And so some of the land titling pilots and other things of that nature, you need the characteristics of the public blockchain to do that. I don't think there's anything that you can only do on a private or permissioned blockchain. I think that they get their appeal from the fact that you can bound their limits and permission their users. But I think over time, you'll see the benefits of either using the public blockchain or at least linking in a hybrid way through side chains or bundling or other types of ways that you settle transactions to the public blockchain, that you'll see links to the private blockchain.
I think it's the, sort of summing up these last two, it's the social construct. And it's going to be what the regulators say that banks can put on a private versus a public blockchain. It's going to be what is going to be acceptable to the individuals who want to be involved with it. I don't think the technology itself is going to be limiting.
All right, that's all the time we have for this brief panel. Help me thank our panelists.
We do have time for maybe one or two questions. If you're brave enough, there's a microphone sitting in the middle there. If you want to ask, I said one or two, and then brief answers so that we can keep the timings on.
Hello. So my main question is around decentralization. Do we really get decentralization with these blockchain platforms? Some would argue that we're currently kind of holding our breath every month to see if Janet Yellen and her group are going to raise interest rates every month. And, I would almost argue we're now kind of holding our breath to see if the blockchain, the Bitcoin miners and developers are going to agree to raise the block size. So is it not the nature of just human nature that, power just gets centralized and concentrated over time? And so do we really have decentralization? You guys care to comment on that?
I'll answer that real quick. So to me, the decentralization is needed to avoid censorship. And which is why, because decentralization is very inefficient. It's a very inefficient way to achieve something because you have to store it like hundreds of thousands of times, maybe millions of times over and over again. And you only do it if there's a censorship issue, which is why I don't see a need to decentralize smart contracts. So if you have a censorship problem, like in North Korea, probably everything should be decentralized, right? Because they have censorship everywhere. But in the first world, our really biggest problem is value transfer as being constantly censored. So decentralization makes sense. In things that are within the legal structure, I see absolutely no reason to decentralize it. It just makes it more inefficient.
I would say that if you've ever lived in a dormitory with a couple other people or an apartment and you've had to figure out how to divide tasks, you understand how difficult peer governance is. And so when you're trying to do that with all these different stakeholders and they're spread across the entire world, they don't share a common language, and they all have different interests. We're not facing a crisis of governance because what we have not seen is a number of different splits away from the Bitcoin ecosystem. There's enough, power holding people into this to say that there's no benefit for me splitting off with my cadre to go do Bitcoin 1.2 or something like that. But what we have seen is a very steep learning curve in distributed governance. So I think that we haven't seen the answer to that question yet, but we have not seen a failed decentralization model because Bitcoin has not fallen apart.
And I think it's important to think about the decentralization question in two pieces: the decentralization of the actual validation, which is a function, and then the decentralization of the decision making, which is a governance challenge. They are both present, but they are different elements of the ecosystem.
And I think the question is, can you break those two apart in the system?
Cool. I think we'll need to
Thank
leave
you.
it there, but thank you to Jerry, Alan, Joe, Tone, and Carol.
Thank you.